covenant. So let me get the computer going here. Good morning to everybody. We're going to be starting part 2 of our covenant study this morning, talking about promises of God. So, like I said, 2 weeks ago, we did the Adamic covenant or the Edenic covenant, talking about the covenant made to all people through Adam in the Garden of Eden. It's also called a covenant of works because God gave a list of things to do and one thing not to do. And God's really wise because he didn't give a long list of things not to do, because he knew that we weren't even going to be able to not do the one thing that he asked. So there was a list of things to do and a list of things, or one thing not to do. So first of all, a covenant is a binding agreement. It is a legal contract. Now, back before paper, the legal contract was ratified in a different way than two signatures with notaries and stuff like that. So it was a seal. Now, those of y'all who are Bible scholars, usually seals in the Bible are made by what? Blood. By blood. So the seal, instead of being a piece of paper that was signed and sealed, it was a covenant that was made in blood. And we see that very clearly when Jesus was given the new covenant. When he was making the new covenant at the Last Supper, he said, "This cup is my blood, which is a new and everlasting covenant for you." So he made it very clear there. But as we do look through these other covenants over, probably the rest of January, then you're going to see that in each of the cases that there was some blood that was shed. So that being the case, when we go back to the Adamic covenant, what blood was shed? With Adam and Eve. What blood was shed? Where'd they get their clothes? God made animal skin clothes for them. And where did the animal skins come from? The animals. And in order to do that, there was shedding of blood. God did it himself. Okay, so even that first covenant, bless you, there was shedding of blood. All right, so we talked about the Adamic covenant. This morning, we're going to go into the Noahic covenant. So we'll be moving a few chapters over in Genesis to talk about Noah. Then we'll be talking about Abraham, then Moses, the priestly covenant that we see in the book of Numbers, then the Davidic covenant, which is the covenant that the Jewish people still live under today. Okay, and then the new and everlasting covenant that Jesus set down for us in the New Testament. So in the Bible, we see two different kinds of covenants that God makes with his people. Some are unconditional covenants. So that means God keeps the promises that he made regardless of human actions. Okay, so it's basically a one-sided covenant. God says, this is what I'm going to do. Or there are conditional covenants where people have to obey the terms of the covenant in order to receive the promises that were given in it. Okay, and these conditional covenants have good and bad that comes with them. So you do these things, God says, I'm going to do these great things for you. If you do these bad things, then these are the things that are going to come to you. Okay, so usually with a conditional covenant, then there's going to be consequences if you don't keep it. All right. Now, the covenant made with Adam and Eve, this Adamic covenant, is sometimes called the covenant of works. God had a list of things that they must do, and only one thing that they mustn't do, and they failed. God replaced the now defunct covenant of works. with the new covenant. Because the way the covenant works is even if you break one part of it, the whole thing becomes null and void. So God laid out this covenant for Adam and Eve that is throughout all generations. And because they failed in one part, that whole covenant gets thrown out. Okay? So now we've got a new kind of covenant at the time of Noah. And this is a covenant of grace, very different than a covenant of works. So this was the beginning of a series of covenants. And each of these covenants are now rooted in a free gift from God instead of a list of things to do. Okay, so before we jump in, are there any questions? All right, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17. So what I've got to do is I've got to kind of fast forward you through each of these chapters. So this is going to be the Reader's Digest condensed version of the chapters. So Genesis 9, after Adam and Eve's exile from Eden, the Bible gets pretty grim. In Genesis 4, Cain sides with the serpent and kills Abel in cold blood. Lamech brags about his murderous and chauvinistic ways. By the time we get to Genesis 5, we see the phrase, and he died. It happens 8 times, showing how now death is reigning over humanity. So remember, Adam and Eve were created to never experience death. But now there's this big change. By the time we get to Genesis 5, we keep on seeing this recurring theme. Born, did these things, go to bed, and then he died. Born, did these things, go to bed, and then he died. Born, he did these things, they were bad, and he died. Born, did these things, they were worse, and he died. So we see this progression from generation to generation, and in each generation, it's getting worse and worse and worse. Okay? So in Genesis 6, we see that all the wickedness of man is continuing to corrupt all of humanity. So if you look at verse 5, it says, the Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. Y'all, the Bible doesn't lie. The Bible doesn't exaggerate. So when God's looking down and he says that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil, that means everything. So we think the world around us today is corrupt and evil. There's still goodness in this world. So it was worse then than it is now. It is hard to imagine. But everything is everything. Okay? So we're introduced to Noah and his family, and he builds the ark with the help of his sons for 120 years. So now remember, this is pre-flood. So if you look at my timeline map over there, you can see that the lifespan of people is extremely long. Again, it's because God created man to live forever. Well, and that's the thing. So I'm gonna pick on you a little bit, and it's all of us that have this problem. We buy in to the propaganda of the world. The propaganda of the world is that man is destroying the earth and there's not enough resources for us. Okay? That's propaganda of the world. God created this world to be self-sustaining with a fully populated earth. Fill and multiply. Fill the earth. Right now, I saw a graphic. I get graphics that pop up on Instagram that show maps. I love maps. I always have loved maps. And it shows the area of the United States that would be occupied if it was the density of population in New York with 8 billion people, which is the population of the earth, and it only covered 5 states. 8 billion people with the population density of New York only covers 5 states. So there's plenty of room. And God created the earth to be self-sustaining. Even, all of y'all are old enough to remember in the 1970s when there was the big ozone scare, right? Big ozone hole. And we're going to turn into a fiery furnace because of the ozone hole. And so they banned all of the good hairspray. They banned all of the good deodorant. And now we're stuck with what we have because of the ozone hole. Well, even before the ban took effect, scientists found out that the ozone hole was closing. It's a pressure relief valve that God put around the earth so that when greenhouse gases get too high, it opens up, releases greenhouse gases, and then closes up again. And now they know that the ozone hole is cyclical. It grows and shrinks depending on what's going on. Because more carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide is created by natural things of the earth than people. Okay? I mean, think about it. Besides the greenery of the rainforest, volcanoes produce more pollution than man can even begin to pollute. God had that in mind when he created everything. So we all tend to fall into this trap, but God's created us and the world to be able to sustain many more people than what we currently have. Even at our consumption rate. Yeah. Yeah. So don't fall into the trap. We are supposed to be stewards and we're supposed to take care of things that are around us. So I'm not saying go out and, pillage the earth and pollute. We're supposed to take care of God's creation. Yeah, well, that's Governor Richards. Yeah. All right. So that's my soapbox for today. In chapter 7, God seals them in an ark with representatives of all the animal. And then in chapter 8, the flood recedes, and exactly 5 months after the rains began, the ark comes to rest on Mount Ararat. Okay? So at the end of chapter 8, they're off the ark now, and Noah builds an altar, and he makes a sacrifice of burnt offerings of the animals and birds that were approved for that purpose. So Gary got a little bit of sneak peek on this a couple of weeks ago. How many animals did Noah put on the ark? Trick question. That's why you aren't answering.
It's not a trick. It's just one of each kind.
So we go a pair. Yeah, we go a pair of every kind of animal. No.
There were duplicates of those kinds.
Okay, so yes and no. So most of the species that God brought to the ark, it was just a male and female of offspring bearing age. But there was a list of animals that God told Noah to take many of. So the animals that were meant for sacrifice, because the sacrificial system, even though it hadn't been written down yet, it was already happening. We know that from the Garden of Eden, because Cain and Abel were bringing sacrifices already to God. So the sacrificial system was already happening. It wasn't a system yet. It was just their offerings to God. And so there were animals that Noah was commanded to bring 2 of. Those showed up and got on the ship by themselves. There were some that he was commanded to bring 7 of. And then there was some that he was commanded to bring many of. So this question that a lot of naysayers like to ask, what did the animals eat on the ark? Well, just because I said that doesn't mean that they get to eat each other. There was food. There was lots of hay. There was lots of grain. And so there's really 2 answers. First of all, there is death in the world now, so we can't say that they can't kill each other and all of a sudden the lions are herbivores. Okay, we can't say that for sure. Maybe, but we don't know. But there was plenty of room on the ark. For those of y'all that have gone to any of the Noah's Ark recreations, you can see that's a huge ship. And there's a lot of storage area in there, even after putting a pair of every species of animal on that ship. Okay, it's big. So at the end of chapter 8, they're off the ship now, and Noah makes a sacrifice of burnt offerings. So it's not like, oh, there goes a couple of species of animal that we don't know existed. No, these were meant to be used for the sacrifice. Verse 21 tells us the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice. And he said to himself, I am well pleased. Okay, so the Lord was pleased with what? The aroma. Barbecue. Yeah. So he loves the smell of barbecue. We see this again and again and again. But instead of taking it literally, remember the Bible is connected. You'll hear more about this next week. From Genesis all the way to Revelation. They're not meant to be looked at as 66 separate books. Each of these books tie in with each other to give us a bigger picture of who God is and what God does. So this aroma, there's something else that God considers a pleasing aroma in the New Testament. Do you remember what it is? The prayers of his people. The prayers of his people. It's exactly the same word in Hebrew as the smell of good barbecue. Okay, so this is actually foreshadowing of things that God is going to later put down in words for rules of how to worship him. But this sweet aroma of sacrifice from his people. So it's not just good barbecue that he's loving. He's loving the sacrifice, people giving up something special to them for his benefit. Okay, even though he needs nothing, the fact that we're willing to give up something means everything to him. Okay, Genesis 8:21 and 22, he says, I will never again curse the ground because of the human race, even though everything they think or imagine is bent toward evil from childhood. So that means even the children are evil. I will never again destroy all living things. As long as the earth remains, there will be planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. That's kind of a weird thing to say. It kind of struck me. And so, of course, I had to dig into it a little bit. So this phrase, the statement that God makes here, can be considered a covenant. But notice there's no if then. If you do these things, then God will do these things. If you don't do these things, then God won't do these things. We don't see any of that. So what kind of covenant is this one? Unconditional. Great. So this is an unconditional. So God says everything the human race thinks and does is evil. But then he says, I will not destroy the earth. But this is only after Noah makes his sacrifice. Why? What did I tell you had to happen for every covenant? Blood. Okay, so there was the shedding of blood. And even though people are completely evil and have no good thoughts, Noah did something that was selfless, that had no benefit to him, actually would be a loss for him by making this sacrifice to honor God. So this shows God that, yep, I have chosen well, and Noah is not completely evil. And there's hope for people. Okay? So after Noah makes his sacrifice. So God does something else really cool in verse 22. He says, as long as the earth remains, there will be planting and harvest. And this is in connection with cold and heat, summer and winter, night and day. There hasn't been any cold or heat, nor summer or winter, nor rain, storms, snow before this. What happened? Yeah. So where did all the water from the flood came from? Two sources. Okay. The firmament, love the word. So there was a water bubble, for lack of a better word, that surrounded the earth. Okay. It was a water canopy. And that water canopy protected the earth from all of the solar radiation, cosmic radiation, and all of the nuclear radiation that would come from space. And then there was also the oceans of water that were underneath the earth that burst open, which caused the surface of the earth to shrink, mountains raised up, created valleys, ravines, and all of those things. And so everything now after the flood is completely different than it was before the flood. Before the flood, there were no seasons. It was perfect rainforest temperature all around the earth all the time. But now after the flood, we've got seasons. So the effect of the flood actually tilted the earth to cause seasons. The effect of the flood created polar ice caps. It actually ushered in an ice age. So the ice age that we see, like the saber-toothed tiger and woolly mammoth and all of that, that was because of the flood. That was all ushered in because of the flood. So now we've got the whole balance of the earth that God had created upset, and it has to readjust and reach a new equilibrium. Well, that new equilibrium is what we know today. Summer, winter for us. We don't get fall and spring here very much. Then we've got drought, we've got flood, we've got hurricanes, we have earthquakes, we got volcanoes, we got tsunamis. All of that stuff was brought in because of the flood. Didn't exist prior to that. Okay. So conditions. Covenants have to have conditions. So 8:21, God will never again destroy all living things. That's important because this sets up something new that we can see throughout history, that whenever some calamity befell the Jewish nation, there was always a remnant. He never destroyed them all, regardless of how evil they were, even in the time of the judges. There will now be seasons of the year. We see in verse 22. Animals will now look upon man with terror. This didn't exist before. And we see that in chapter 9, verse 2. Animals will now all be placed in man's power. We see that in verse 2. Animals will be man's for food. That didn't happen prior to the flood. Murder now is punishable by death. Only God can take a life. An animal kills a person, it must die. So this rule of murder didn't only exist for humans. It also existed for animals. God will never destroy the earth by flood again. That's in verse 11 of chapter 9. So those are the conditions of the covenant. Now notice, are there any rules in there for people to follow? Man must do this, man must do that. No, there's none of that. All of this is a list of promises that God has made. That's why this is called a covenant of grace. There's no works for man to do in this. It's just gift. A rainbow is created as a sign of the covenant with man and with all of the earth. So we see that in verse 12. God will place the rainbow in the clouds. The rainbow is to show us that God is eternally reminded of his promise. Now, read that sentence slowly. The rainbow is for what? To show, just to show us of a fact. God's eternally reminded of the promise. Now, when I was leading worship here full time, there was a song that we sang, and it had a phrase in it that it's a song being sung to God, and it says, "So remember your people, remember." See, and somebody came up to me and they were upset. You shouldn't be singing those things because God never forgets. Well, that's true. But this is a celebration of the fact that God remembers his people. Just like the rainbow. It's not God going, "Oh yeah, I forgot. I'm not supposed to kill anybody on the earth with flood anymore." It's not that at all. It's a sign. It's a symbol. Symbolism is huge in scripture. And those that don't understand the symbolism start worshiping the wrong things. Kind of like, oh, we've got to have Lord's Supper or we're going to die. Okay. That's not how it works. Okay. It's a symbol. And that's all this was. So the rainbow is to show us that God always remembers his promise. Okay. And up until this year, I used to get really upset with the whole gay pride thing. They stole the rainbow. They didn't. They didn't. Because the gay pride rainbow, only 6 colors. 6, the number of man, the number of the beast, incomplete of God. 7 is God's completeness, and how many colors are in God's rainbow? 7. Okay, and that's a new revelation for me. I was pretty excited. Gary and I had that discussion too. So, chapter 9, verse 17, then God said to Noah, yes, this rainbow is the sign of the covenant I am confirming with what? All of the creatures of the earth. So this rainbow is not just for man. The animals see the rainbow as well. And the animals somehow innately know what that means. I don't understand, but that's what God says. Okay, pretty cool. So the promise was not just made for man. It was made for all the creatures on the earth. That's pretty cool. Y'all, I'm gonna go a little bit science nerd in here for you. How are the rainbows created? How do we see a rainbow? Refraction of light. So we can kind of reproduce a rainbow by shining white light through a triangular prism. As the light comes in, it bends, and then as it comes out, it bends some more. And the different colors of the light bend different amounts. So by the time it comes out the other end, the white light gets spread out to all of its different colors that we see as the rainbow. Well, there's no prisms floating around in the atmosphere. So how does the light get refracted in the atmosphere? Water molecules. So that means that the position of the sun, the position of the raindrops, and the position of our eyeballs need to be perfectly aligned in order to see a rainbow. In order for a rainbow to be seen, all of these things have to line up just right. It shouldn't happen. Kind of like snow. Snow should not happen. But it does. Because God made it so. It's one of those weird things about the earth that scientists go, I don't know, but it does. Kind of like bumblebees flying. They shouldn't be able to. But they do. Okay? Yeah, little wings, big body. So it's just one of those God mysteries that we don't know. So pretty cool stuff. So the lesson here, when we see the rainbow, we can know for certainty that there will never be another worldwide flood as there was in the days of Noah, no matter how wicked man becomes. No matter how wicked man becomes. And we're not even halfway wicked as were the people prior to the flood. What's really cool is that a lot of people, scientists, they want to say that there was never a worldwide flood, that this was just the known world where people were, and they had a localized flood. Well, if this is the case, then why does every culture in the world, without exception, every culture has a flood story? Even Hawaii. Hawaii has the story of a man named Noe, N-O-E, that had to ride around on the ocean for days and days because there was no more land. That's even in Hawaii. The Polynesians have the same kind of story. Changed a little bit over the centuries, just as stories do, but you can still see the grain of truth in there, which was Noah, his family, and the ark. Okay? So here's my woe. You're going to see a woe in every one of these covenants. Where's the rest of the story? Doesn't man have a part to play in this covenant of grace? Nope. Grace. So I got to define that word for you today. So the definition of grace is the unmerited, which means unearned or undeserved favor of God. Okay? So it's basically a free gift, even though you don't deserve it. That's grace. So we see the covenant of works at the beginning with the Adamic or the Edenic covenant, because you do these things, I will do these things. But now there's no part for man to play. God says, I'm going to do all these things for you. That's grace. Okay? So this covenant of grace is a promise that God made to Noah and his descendants. So first of all, it is unconditional, which means it can't be broken. God doesn't lie. God doesn't change his mind. So he laid this out. It's the way it's going to be. It was made to Noah, his descendants, Ham, Shem, Japheth, and every living creature. And it was also sealed with a sign. So even covenants today are sealed with a sign. It's either going to be a document that's going to be recorded in perpetuity in the courthouse, or it's going to be something more symbolic. Okay, a wedding ring is the sign that you entered into a covenant with your spouse. Okay, so it was sealed with a sign. So let's look at some of these details. Man was commanded to be fruitful and multiply. We've seen that again. We saw that before. The same mandate was given to Adam and Eve. Well, why does he got to tell them again? Because everybody's dead. So now we've got just 4 couples that have to repopulate the earth. The animals would now be in fear of man. Prior to the flood, animals and man had a special relationship that would no longer exist. God placed an innate fear of man in every animal, even those that are much stronger than humans. So if you look at lions, tigers, bears, elephants, I had to add elephants in there though. So even they, being stronger than man, still have this wariness of man. That's that innate fear that's built into all of the animals. All of the animals of the earth have now been given for food. So perhaps the earth was less productive agriculturally after the flood, so man cannot survive just on plants, fruits, and grains. Maybe. The new seasons put in place by God definitely will not allow continuous plant sources, because plants don't bear fruit in the winter. And you have to wait for them to grow in the spring for them to produce fruit. And the refrigerators aren't working yet. The killing of animals was already happening, and not just for sacrifice. They were killing animals for clothing purposes, rendering fat for lamps, harvesting sinew for bows, harvesting bone for tools. So there was already animal death happening. So even those that were trying to follow the rules that were given to Adam and Eve, well, if you harvest these things that you need, well, now the rest of it's just going to go to waste. So I'm just giving these as maybe this is why. Okay. We really don't know, but we do know that God set out a new plan, that now it's okay to eat the animals. Also notice, was there any mandate of what animals not to eat? Nope. So they could eat all of the pork they wanted. Okay. That's a later rule. So we'll have to talk about that later. Okay.
So prior to the time, there was no indication in the Bible that.
No. I mean, they probably were, considering man was so evil, but the animal, it was kind of like every animal that existed was a pet prior to the flood. There was no fear of man, and they would just commune together, So yeah, very different, very different. So there was a stipulation though. And it says you never eat meat that still has its lifeblood in it. All right. So this is not a mandate to eat our steaks well done instead of medium rare. Or like my father-in-law, he ate his blue rare. Ugh. I don't want to chew my meat that hard. Okay. So at breakfast, you need to give thanks for the bacon. Don't give thanks for the eggs, because it was the pig that's made the greater sacrifice. Oh, yeah. That's an old joke. Yeah. So it isn't about the meat at all. It's about the blood. Without blood, there is no life. Without the shedding of blood, there is no sacrifice. Or in the New Testament, without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin. Okay. Blood of all creatures is to be considered sacred. Even the Native Americans understood this. And they weren't Christian, but they understood that at each kill, they had to give special honor to the blood that was drained from their kill. Okay? Respect the sacrifice of the animal's life. That's the bottom line. Okay? So that's what's going on here. So the blood. The blood was the sign of the mercy for Israel at the first Passover. The blood sealed God's covenant with Israel. Blood sanctified the altar. Blood set aside the priests. Blood made atonement for God's people. Blood sealed the new covenant. Blood justifies us. Blood brings redemption. Blood brings peace with God. Blood cleanses us. Blood gives entrance to God's holy place. Blood sanctifies us. Blood enables us to overcome Satan. Blood is a huge, huge noun in all of Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation. It's all about the blood. More on that next week. Okay? So the blood is really special. God requires blood for the violent death of man. King James missed the boat here a little bit in the 10 Commandments where it says, thou shalt not kill. Well, that means you have to be like the Tibetan monks that won't even step on an ant because it would condemn themselves. Okay? So that word kill is better translated as murder. Okay? Thou shalt not murder. So murder means I am willfully and purposefully taking someone else's life for the benefit of myself. So that means all of your conscientious objectors are either uninformed or cowards. Because even in wartime, you are obeying the law of the land, which Jesus has told us to, when you are conscripted to fight an enemy. Now, you're still going to feel the pain of taking someone else's life, but you're not going to be condemned for breaking one of the 10 Commandments because of it. Because is it for your benefit? It's for the country's benefit, not for yours. Killing somebody to protect someone else, is that for your benefit? No. But when you have premeditated manslaughter, okay, that's the kind of murder that we're talking about here. And in that case, if you spill someone's blood on purpose, then the same will be required of you. And that was set out in chapter 9, verse 5. When a person's blood is shed, there must be an accounting for it. Because since God created man with his image, life is inherently precious and cannot be taken without giving account to God. There has to be an accounting. There has to be a balancing of the books. Okay? If a wild animal kills a person, the animal must die. If a person murders another person, they're acting like a wild animal. Therefore, they must die. Verse 6 tells us that this justice must be meted out by hand. So to kill somebody because they committed murder has to be done by hand. This is so the executioner feels the weight of the taking of a life also. That's pretty cool. So just pushing a button, that's not what God has mandated. So when we see a rainbow, in conclusion, we should always be reminded of God's faithfulness and his amazing grace. God is a holy and righteous God who has a holy hatred for sin and who will not allow sin to go unpunished forever. And God has held lifeblood as the ultimate price since Genesis. So, little sneak peek. There's this thing called the crimson thread through Scripture. The crimson thread. And that's what we'll be talking about next week. Big church. Okay. So in summary, the Noahic covenant, be fruitful and multiply, was really the only thing that he told people to do. Okay. But then his promise, I set seasons, cold, heat. I won't destroy the earth with flood again, and a rainbow will be the sign. Okay. So that is the second set of promises that we see in scripture. I hope you learned something new about Noah today that you may not have known before. So before we end, does anybody have any questions, observations, anything about
About a month and a half ago, I actually saw 2 rainbows.
double rainbow? Yep. So in order to make that happen, there has to be 2 sheets of rain, one in front of the other, that the light is shining through. Double rainbows. That is really neat. I've only seen that once, and it was about 300 degrees of a rainbow. Pretty cool. There was 8. So Noah, Mrs. Noah, Ham, Shem, Japheth, and their wives. So there's 8 of them. Good stuff. Anybody else?
Before the flood, with the communing of animals with man, was there communication between them?
We
just recently,
we don't know that explicitly, but implicitly we can deduce that. 2 things. First of all, when the serpent was talking to Eve, it didn't freak her out. It was like a common occurrence for the serpent to be talking, or any of the animals for that matter. The second is later in the Old Testament, when Balaam's donkey turns around to him and says, "Why are you beating me? What have I done to you?" And Balaam didn't say, "Oh, why is a donkey talking to me?" It says, "Because you won't go as I have commanded you." Okay. He's having a communication with the donkey, and it's no big deal. So C.S. Lewis, when he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, he wrote it so that the animals could talk to people, because indication in scripture is that's the case, not only in the early Old Testament, but also again in the new heaven and new earth, that there's going to be that kind of communication. L.F. Baum, who wrote the series of books that The Wizard of Oz came from, did the same thing. And the animals in Oz could speak at the beginning of the book, but as evil took over the land, animals began to lose their ability to talk. So again, that's taken from this implicit notion that we have from the Old Testament. Cool. Anybody else? All right, cool. That's all I've got for you today.
so you've implied that the service next week will add some more revelation to what you shared today.
Yes.
Nice. All right. Really talk to you.
Can't figure out how to stop the video.
Oh.
It's not showing up on the screen. So sometimes it shows up over here, but it's not. It's not recording anymore. It says that. Still can't get it. Oh, there it is.